In 1970, I had finished my bachelor's degree in 1969, and then in 1970, I was in California. I was visiting my cousin, and my cousin was a nurse, and she introduced me to Roxana, our friend Roxana Erickson, and she said to me privately that Roxana's father was a famous psychiatrist. And I said, well, I won't hold that against her. At the time, my primary interest was fighting against the Vietnam War. I was working with organizations, for example, Joan Baez, a folk singer, and we were protesting against the Vietnam War. My day job was working in psychiatry as an attendant at a psychiatric hospital. Now, I had no memory of that. I had no conscious memory of being introduced to Roxana Erickson. And Erickson in 1970, the name didn't mean anything to me. But when I was in my master's degree program, I had a psychiatrist who was my supervisor. And I had a psychologist who was a very good therapist, and he was also my supervisor. And so I didn't want to mix supervision. So I asked the psychiatrist, would he teach me hypnosis? And he said, come to my office on Saturday morning, I'll hypnotize you. I went, because I was afraid of hypnosis and losing control, and I thought he was just going to teach me didactically. And so I went to his office with trepidation, and at the time I'm drumming my fingers nervously, unconsciously, on the arm of the chair. And the psychiatrist, Dr. O'Connor, says to me, Jeff, watch your fingers. Notice the pattern of movement. Notice the rhythm of the movement. Notice how the movement slows down. And this was my first conscious example of utilization. And I said to him, well, what do I read? And he said, read Milton Erickson. I said, who? He said, Milton Erickson. Now, the only book that was available at the time was a compendium that was compiled by J. Haley of Erickson's papers. And it was a very expensive book, and I bought the book, and I went, oh my gosh. Because what Erickson was conceiving as psychotherapy was light years beyond anything that I had understood at that time as psychotherapy. So I wrote this frivolous letter saying that I had written a paper working with the auditory hallucinations of schizophrenic patients, which was a utilization technique. And that could I please come to Phoenix and be his student? Now, I was so shy at the time. This was beyond me, and I couldn't even imagine how I did that. Actually, I had previously written a letter to my cousin in Tucson, who was then living in Tucson. I said, I started studying Milton Erickson, and if you ever go to Phoenix, you have to visit him. This man's a genius. And then she reminded me about meeting Roxana, and she had spent, somebody creeping through the process here. And so she had reminded me that I had met Roxana. I wrote to Roxana, I wrote to Dr. Erickson. I said, can I be your student? And basically he wrote back a beautiful letter that I must have read 15 or 20 times because it surprised me, it shocked me that this genius was personalizing a letter to an admiring student. And the letter said, when you read my work, presupposing that I would, don't pay attention to the techniques, the pattern, the wording of suggestions. The really important thing is motivation for change and the fact that no human being ever fully knows his own capabilities. I still get a chill when I remember sitting in my little Volkswagen reading Erickson's letter, being stunned that he would personalize a letter to me. And so I said, okay, I don't need to be your student. Can I just come and visit? And so, yes, in 73, at the end of 1973, I made my first of many trips to Phoenix. And then eventually in 1978, 2 years before Erickson died, I moved to Phoenix, effectively taking over his private practice because he was retired and he didn't have anybody to refer patients to. So I was working at a hospital, but within just a little over a year, I was in full-time private practice, courtesy of Milton Erickson, which, by the way, in any city, any major city, it's hard to establish a private practice for an individual practitioner. Then in that interim period when I was traveling frequently as I could to visit Dr. Erickson, I brought a friend of mine who had expertise in video. This is the silent film. And we set up, and Dr. Erickson did an induction with Paul. and it was incredible. Now, I was having all this private time with Milton Erickson. I didn't want to give that up, but I wanted the videos, which means that I needed to bring somebody. So I was ambivalent about doing this because, oh my gosh, you got this time to talk with Milton Erickson about therapy and life and being a better Jebzayig, and I tremendously valued that, but I wanted the video. So Erickson was working with Paul, a naive subject, did an incredible induction. We recorded it, and then when we finished the video, we wanted to play it, and there was no sound. Paul had forgotten to plug in the microphone. Now, it was just as much my responsibility, and Erickson was reminding me that it wasn't just Paul, but I'm a little extra punitive, and I say, well, it was Paul's fault. He forgot to turn on the microphone, and of course he was terribly embarrassed. So the next day, Erickson says to me, put on that silent film. So I put on the silent film, and Paul is watching the silent film. It's just Paul. It trans. And I'm watching Erickson and Paul. I'm operating the video camera. And Erickson looks intently at Paul. And Paul's looking at the video, and Erickson looks intently at Paul. And Paul's looking at the video, and Erickson's looking intently at Paul. And Paul goes into a trance. Well, something had to happen. And it was the power of expectation, but it was the power of utilization. And Steve DeShazer wrote a book, Utilization, the Foundation of Solutions. And if there's any single characteristic of Milton Erickson that was well developed, it was utilization. So whatever happened, Erickson was an alchemist. And he was a person who, if you gave him a little bit of straw, he would turn it into gold. And this was his life. Everything was utilized. And if you want an answer to how to be happy, how to be creative, how to be motivated, that is based in utilization. So over the past 40 years, my striving for myself is to increasingly anchor myself in a utilization state, being response ready to respond constructively to whatever exists in the total weave of the situation. Freud, I think, contributed 13 cases to the literature. Erickson contributed hundreds of cases. No therapist in history has contributed as many cases to the literature as Milton Erickson. Every single one of them is based in utilization.